Clare, how significant is this trade agreement with Japan? Isn't it just symbolic?
No, not at all. And there are several factors around the trade deal. One is how long it's taken, which is a lesson to all of us, and there's still more to do.
How long has it taken?
It's 4 years to get this far, and there's still further processes to go through, so that's something we need to keep a steady eye on. But also, it is between these two enormous kind of economic bases, and we who have Japanese manufacturers or other companies, need to keep a weather eye on this, because what will happen to our trade with Japan?
Right, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But I mean, is it symbolic in terms of PR ahead of the G20? Because there's still so much yet to negotiate. I mean, they haven't actually tied this deal down, have they?
What's happened is that we've arrived at a moment from where it would seem that there is no pulling back now.
Right.
So there's a number of tidying up exercises still left to do. What I found very interesting about this was that the Japanese stated that this was a deal done between them and the 28 members of the European Union.
So including
including
the UK.
the United Kingdom, which I believe sends a very strong signal that the United Kingdom remains open for business and that we welcome this deal, and we are in a position to do similar deals ourselves post-Brexit.
Right, and do you agree with that? I mean, isn't this then an example of what could be achieved, albeit in a perhaps shorter space of time if the government gets its way, a free trade deal between the UK and the EU?
Well, I mean, we absolutely have to land a deal between us and the EU.
Well, they've managed it with Japan.
Over 4 years. We have less than 2 years left in terms of sorting out our exit, which then becomes really significant in terms of what we do into transition. But also, you've got an equality of the scale of the economies when you're looking at the EU 28 and Japan. We're in a different position sort of in the future if we're looking at just the UK doing trade.
Right, and isn't that the problem? Twice as long as the amount of time that Theresa May and David Davis have at their disposal to secure a trade deal between the UK and EU.
I think the challenges are huge, and you shouldn't underestimate that. And
Do you think they're actually impossible to achieve?
Well, the other thing to bear in mind with this deal is it doesn't cover services. Any deal we have must cover services as well. So the challenges are far greater than the Japanese challenge, and therefore we really are going to have to concentrate our minds in a very short space of time to deliver this.
Right, so do you think it's realistic?
I think unless we actually concentrate our mind to the real issues, we are not going to hit this timeline.
Right, and the real issues are immigration before trade and the economy, or the other way round?
No, the economy must come first. Immigration must be a secondary issue. If we're going to try and do it the other way around, then I'm afraid our economy and this whole issue of meeting the deadlines is going to unravel very quickly indeed. Let's
talk about Jean-Claude Juncker. That was quite an outburst. He was very cross. Not many MEPs turned up to hear him address the Parliament. Do you think he was right to criticise you guys?
No, I don't. He had a moment. That happens. We all have our moments every now and then. The reality is, like Westminster, if people aren't in the chamber, that's because they're working elsewhere in the building. I was in working groups that morning. I had 3 back-to-back working groups on different pieces of legislation we're working on. So the reality is very different from the one he was talking about. That we have Monday to Thursday, as with Westminster, to get a lot of work done, and you concentrate on effective work rather than sitting in chambers.
Do you think do you agree he overstepped the mark, or do you feel, as President of the Commission, he was due a bit of respect from elected representatives like yourself to at least come and hear him speak?
Well, I think this works both ways. There has been a number of occasions where he should have actually been present in the chamber himself, and he wasn't.
Right.
So this does work both ways, and if we are willing to accept that he can't always be there, he needs to do the same for us.
He got a royal telling off, though, didn't he, from the head of the Parliament?
I would expect nothing less.
Oh, right. We'll end it there, then.
And he's apologised since.
Who, Jean-Claude Juncker?
Mr Juncker, yes.
Now, what will the EU look like after Brexit? That has been the subject of some discussion amongst European leaders, and this week, new French President Emmanuel Macron waded into the debate. In a speech on Monday, Mr Macron said that the European Union had to be revived by a new generation of leaders. And he announced that France and Germany would launch democratic conventions by the end of 2017 with the aim of refounding Europe. He insisted each member state would be free to sign on or not, but there is no longer time for quick fixes. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has signalled her support for reform in Europe. A day after the Brexit negotiations began, she told the Federation of German Industries she was open to the idea of a joint EU finance minister, but only if the framework conditions are right. And she said she would discuss a eurozone-wide budget, as long as it's clear that this will truly strengthen structures and do meaningful things. The debate follows on from Jean-Claude Juncker's white paper outlining 5 scenarios for the future of the EU, which was discussed at the Rome summit in March. That ranged from the EU refocusing solely on the common market to faster integration between nations. And amidst all that and the Brexit negotiations, the UK will have to decide if it is still to join an EU-wide battle group, which Britain has committed forces to join from 2019, after the UK is due to leave the EU. Well, we've been joined by Artie Shanker from the think tank Open Europe. Welcome to the programme. What is Macron's grand plan, do you think, for Europe? What would these democratic conventions actually look like?
So, of course, there are a lot of expectations on Macron's shoulders right now. This was a manifesto promise of his to hold democratic conventions in France, but he hopes to extend it across the EU. And I think this is a basis on which he constructed his own campaign when he was running for president here. And the expectation is that you can build a bottom-up sort of democracy and the people themselves can shape the priorities, be it of the French presidency or the European Union going forward.
But is it just a talking shop? I mean, is it a way of just being seen to be doing something without any real substance to it?
I think that is one criticism of it. What he hopes to achieve with these sort of democratic conventions is to focus minds in Europe much more soundly. And given Jean-Claude Juncker's Brexit white paper earlier this year, where he suggested that perhaps there are different methods that the EU can pursue going forward for reform, one of which was, of course, do less but more effectively, I think that Macron's democratic conventions attempts to speak to that, attempts to ask the people, what really do you want us to focus on?
What about this new generation of leaders? I mean, he's new, but who else is he talking about?
Well, of course, we do have the Irish president, who is now, of course, the youngest in the EU.
Yes.
And I think what he's speaking about more generally, rather than just who is leading these nations, is the idea of rejuvenating this EU project, which is, of course, the mandate that he thinks he has.
Right. Do you think Emmanuel Macron is going to be successful in, if you like, trying to reshape Europe, liberating the member states once the UK leaves?
I'm not quite sure what liberating the member states looks like, but in terms of his attitude to Europe, it was interesting watching the French campaign because he ran an unashamedly pro-European campaign. You know, of course, it's not perfect. Westminster's not perfect. There are a whole load of institutions that aren't perfect. But he ran it against a sort of anti-European campaign from Le Pen, and he won much better than people thought he might do. So from that basis of looking at then how he can re-establish a kind of enthusiasm from Europe, I think is his starting point, and I think that's probably a good idea.
Right, I mean, how does he do that, though? Because, as Clare was saying, there was a lot of sentiment that was anti-Europe within France as well. Yes, Emmanuel Macron did win overwhelmingly. But if you look at what he can actually do, is he going to bring, and should he bring, all the eurozone states even closer together? Is that what he is planning? More integration, and will that work?
Well, I admire his ambitions, but I think what he's doing is going from a platform of having fought the French elections, where the galvanising force was the fact that he had a far-right extremist as a candidate against him. And even then, the turnout was not enthused enough to be able to say that the French people felt enthused to come and back Macron on this. For him then to be able to say that he can take this on a across Europe-wide scale, I believe really is very ambitious on his part. Right.
I mean, it doesn't sound like Sajjad thinks that can work, taking note of your language. But is further integration for European countries within the EU the answer if you take on board some of the Euroscepticism that does exist in France? I mean, it's still divided like many other countries. Is it going to work?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of what's being talked about is going to take a long time to deliver, quite possibly after we have left the European Union. So to a certain extent, it's up to them. They will make the choices. The EU 27 will decide how the EU 27 work best together. We are going to be watching from the outside.
Right.
And
looking at what Emmanuel Macron is trying to do, if we take the idea that he is trying to bring the eurozone countries together and they're looking at ideas that will actually promote that, is that going to be harder for the UK to negotiate its deal?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to discuss the feasibility of his projects. And he accepts that this is not something that is going to happen in the very near term, his idea of reforming.
What's the sort of timing that he's pushing on this?
Well, what he's suggesting is that he understands that the idea of a eurozone budget, a eurozone minister, eurozone parliament will require a lot of backing from Germany and obviously the smaller states as well. And the reticence on the German side is the idea that France needs to get its own economy in shape before Germany is willing to back it. So Macron has said that he will undertake labour market reforms and other economic reforms domestically first and foremost before going to Germany with these ideas and putting them in force.
Right.
So the idea. So whether or not this will form part of the negotiations, I think the first thing we have to consider is what timeline does Macron and the eurozone imagine for these sort of reforms? Right.
And the direction of travel, though, if it does go down that route, and I take your point that obviously he's got a big enough job trying to reform France in terms of labour reforms, but will that be a good thing or a bad thing, you think, for the UK as it's negotiating its exit?
It's difficult to know because, of course, this is not just a concern for the UK. This is a concern that has been present for many of the smaller member states in the EU as well. The idea that the EU's final destination will actually be the eurozone. And what matters then is, if you're a smaller state on the edge without membership of the euro, do you still form part of the EU? So if this is the direction that the EU looks like it's going to go down, the UK will not be alone in watching from the outside. I think there will be smaller member states that also will look and ask, what will your EU membership mean in the future? Will I have to join the euro? Right,
but it's hardly a surprise that closer integration is in some ways what Macron wants. He's, as you say, unashamedly pro-EU, pro-European. Do you think it'll make it difficult for the UK in its negotiations?
I think the dynamics are there for the UK to find itself in a situation that whilst Europe is still trying to figure out quite what direction it wants to take itself, that is going to have a direct bearing on the negotiations it has with us. One of the criticisms we're currently getting from Europe is we don't quite know whether we can negotiate with the British government. How stable are you? But actually it applies the other way as well in terms of vision for Europe. They themselves aren't entirely clear as to where they're going to go. And the other factor to bear in mind when it comes to Macron is this. He's a man who has fought one election in his lifetime, and that is to become president of France. He has yet to face the hard realities of political dynamics in France, let alone at a European level.
What do you think about some of the other smaller members of the EU? Do you think there really will now be this complete two-tier EU emerging?
There's a resistance to that from the smaller member states. It was one of the options in the five-point plan that you were talking about, was this effectively two-speed Europe. And I know that isn't a direction that a number of EU member states want to take. But it's also, I mean, the EU is a bit like a tanker, as we know. It doesn't turn around quickly. We are looking at having a much more dynamic and much quicker negotiation in terms of at least our exit. What the future relationship looks like, I hope, takes considerably longer if we're going to do it well. So these are separate conversations, and I don't think they're going to have such a significant impact. You're talking about conventions over years, a couple of years or whatever. That's not going to feed into a political process that's going to impact directly on our negotiations.
Taking one specific, Britain's commitment to the battle group, for example, the EU battle group, how do you feel about that?
Well, we await an announcement from the United Kingdom on this. We have, of course, said that we will go ahead and provide the headquarters for that in the immediate coming future. But what's important is that certainly from a bilateral defence point of view, we have commitments, including from Macron in France, that should deepen. Whether we progress with that to a European level yet remains to be seen. But
what do you think?
The thing with the battle groups is this. They've been in existence for 10 years, but never been used once. Everything we have done, we have had to do on a bilateral level. So when one looks at the practicality of it, it's questionable. But when one looks at the theory behind it, it's a question of where is your commitment?
Right. Do you think it will last? in terms of our commitment to it?
I think security and defence is one of the areas where there is a kind of strong interest in every regard that we work together. NATO and the EU are working together much more closely now than they ever have done, in fact. So, we need to be part of that. My concern is that we're taking ourselves out of the kind of taking a leading role in it, that we will be participants if we manage to get a deal that includes security and defence at all. And that, I think, will disadvantage us, that we then become very much a second-class participant in these processes.
Just very briefly, are you being sort of embraced still by your colleagues in the Parliament or marginalised these days?
Personally, I mean, people still get on very well with all of us. I think, well, certainly those that have played a constructive part on behalf of the United Kingdom. Professionally, of course, now people don't just say yes. When you speak to them, they want to go away and check things out.
Comforting to know they used to say yes before immediately.
Oh, they certainly did.
Absolutely. We had a huge role that we played in the Parliament.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you very much. Now, we've heard a lot about the financial obligations the UK may have to meet when it leaves the EU. But once they lose one of the Union's biggest net contributors, how might the remaining 27 countries balance the books? Adam Fleming's been in Strasbourg finding out.
Big news in Strasbourg this week, the opening of the new Visitors Centre, which includes a 360-degree recreation of the hemicycle. In the real version of this, MEPs were receiving a briefing from the European Commission on the future size and shape of the EU's finances for the 7-year period from 2020. Finances that will have a Brexit-shaped hole in them of between 10 and 12 billion euros every year. Budget Commissioner Günther Oettinger explained the EU was also taking on new tasks like fighting terrorism, so it needed more cash for what's called the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, the MFF. It could mean some fundamental changes to how the budget operates. For example, could richer countries like Germany be asked to pay in more? Could poorer countries that take out, like Bulgaria and Romania, have to take out less?
If we have an overview, then we can say for financing all what's needed, then we need more from this country and from the different country, and we have to stop with all of the special conditions for some of the countries. It was not only Britain, Great Britain, it was also Germany and also, I think, so Netherlands. And there is no reason to get special treatment.
The Commission has mooted a European pollution tax on cars as a way of raising its own revenue, along with charging visitors who come to the EU, and a few other ideas, seen as a power grab by some.
I think that the budget should remain strongly linked with national states, with member states, as cornerstones of the European Union. So I'm not in favor of any new revenues, any European taxes, or any autonomous sources for the budget.
But when does all of this have to be decided? And what role for the 751 MEPs? Or the 600 and something who'll be left after the Brits have gone?
Parliament has a real say, I would say. Of course, we don't decide how the MFF will be. The member states decide that. But if we don't like it, then on the other hand, so they have to listen to us to a certain degree. And so narrow window, summer, September 2018, before the election, June 2019, we have to have a ready package by that time to be able to tell the European citizens what we are going to do with the budget.
Finally, a quick trip to the new photo booth. One thing will disappear from the financial picture altogether. Thanks to Brexit, there will be no more UK rebate, so the budget will look much simpler. And that gets the thumbs up around here.
Nice cheesy smile, Adam Fleming reporting there. So, Clare Moody, any ideas how the EU should plug that gap of some, let's say 10 billion euros a year?
Well, it's going to be the negotiations go on. The MFF, the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, that was being talked about, the catchy title, goes on for 7 years. We're in the middle of the current 7-year process. The negotiations are beginning now. That was part of the conversation with Oettinger this week.
But do you accept that they've got a bit of a headache, the EU? I mean, that could be to the UK's advantage, because they are going to lose our money.
And this is where the divorce bill comes in. It also is about what happens after Brexit and what we will choose or how we will contribute. Because it may well be we contribute into programmes beyond Brexit. So it's going to be a complicated sums that are done around this.
And do you accept that, Sajjad, that actually there could well be a situation, and would you support it if the UK continues to contribute to funds that we still want to be a part of during a transitional phase?
Well, I think the British people are going to have to accept one thing, that there are going to be some form of continued payments after the UK leaves the European Union.
What do you think, ballpark figure of?
Well, I really can't put any figure on it because the negotiations are so wide at the moment. But one thing is clear, Europe is going to have to learn to live with far less money than it currently has. So it's either going to have to increase its efficiencies, one thing it's never been particularly good at, or it's going to have to find new ways of raising money.
Right, and we'll talk about the new revenues in just a second, but you said the British people are going to have to accept continued payments. What would they be for?
It depends. I mean, some of the payments would be for ongoing programmes that we take part in.
Like?
A lot of the educational programmes that we are a part of, our
Erasmus
universities
and these sorts of
our
things?
universities, etc. Yeah,
right.
Research, development, this sort of thing. But particularly, if we're going to maintain our access to the single market, then there are going to be substantial sums that will need to be paid for that access.
Right. So how much would you be prepared to pay?
Well, that's a part of the negotiations, as I say. I'm not in a position to put a figure on this. What I do know is it's our largest export market, and without it, our economy is going to suffer greatly.
Right. I mean, that sounds like we won't be leaving in March 2019 in any complete, comprehensive way if we're still going to be paying into funds that are joint EU-UK initiatives.
There's various elements to this, but as Sajjad said, we've got if we will simply, as things stand, not be ready to leave the single market in 2019. We've only just started the negotiations on one element of the divorce. We're a year after the referendum, 3 months after Article 50. It would be astonishing. Any government would be able to achieve that complicated deal. So yes, we will continue paying. We agreed to a multi-annual financial framework, which goes through to 2020, and the bills come in after that. And then there is the element of needing to stay within the single market.
Well, that may disappoint many people in the Conservative Party, not least, and others too, if UK isn't out by March 2019 completely. But let's look at some of the revenue streams. I mean, we heard in that film, you know, one of the contributors, I don't want to see new taxes and I don't want to see new revenue streams brought in. Do you think that would be unpopular with the Parliament?
I think there is real resistance to that sort of a move, whereby the European Union can directly start to impose taxes of its own. However, this is also a part of the ongoing debate in Europe today. What is the future of Europe going to be? So this actually today has once again become an open question. And don't be too surprised to see things like the financial transactions tax, for instance, once again back on the table.
All right. Well, as you say, we've got a long, hot summer ahead of us. Thank you very much for being my guests of the day today. That's it from all of us at Politics Europe for now. Bye-bye.